Hello everyone. This session is on the ideological accounts of Indian villages. This is about our understanding about on Indian villages through various ideological sources. So this session covers the various ideological sources which we have been used to understand the nature of Indian villages during the traditional times. We'll also look into the major scholars who have made this attempt, and also a bit about and understand the nature and characteristics of Indian villages during each period from the Vedas till the Mughal period. So let's start with uh, the Vedic period. So we have people like Dr. Radha Kumud Mukherjee, K.P. Jaiswal, and Dr. Altekar looking into the various hymns of Rig Veda, exploring the terminologies, which could be connected with the village life, interpreting them, and we found that there is a collectivist approach to all problems, and we can see a collective, general or national consciousness among the villagers. They also mention the deity called Samajnana or Samajnana, which could be equated with a deity of democracy. And Dr. K.P. Jaiswal, who have looked into the Prithvi Sukta in the Atharva Veda, mentions about the popular assemblies or institutions during that time, which is called samitis, that played a great role in ensuring a sense of unity in diversity. So the scholars have, identified and picked the various terminologies, which could be connected with our understanding about Indian villages. Some of those terminologies include Kula, Gana, Jati, Puga, Vrata, Shreni, Sangha, Samudaya, and Samoha. Valmiki Ramayana and Mahabharata, the great epics, also mentions about Indian villages, and the types of villages mentioned in them are Ghosh and Gram, with Ghosh Mahatar as the head of Ghosh and Gram Mahatar as the head of Gram. And coming down to Manusmriti, Dr. Altekar have done an extensive study, and he uh, you know, uh, talks about having village officials under the king, and they also talk about the role of gram vriddhas, or the elderly, and how they played a very crucial role in managing the village life. So Manusmriti also mentions various terminologies to denote the heads at varying levels. Each gram will be having the head Gramik or Gramani, and a group of 10 villagers will be having the head called Dashi. Then we have Vishanti, and for a collection of 100 villages, we have the head Shati or Shat Gramadhipati, and for a cluster of 1,000 villages, it is Sahasra Gramadhipati. And there are clear indications about the rules and regulations and the responsibilities of people holding each of these positions. So now let's have a little bit of understanding about the village administration during the Vedic period. So the primary responsibility of the village head or Gramani was to ensure protection of the village. Equally important was the responsibility to realize the state dues, collecting all the revenues, and as well as keeping records for them. And coming to the judicial functions in Mahabharata, especially in Shanti Parva, we can see a mentioning of the judicial functions with the primary task with the ganas or kulas at the local level, and the kings becomes the appellate authority. And K.P. Jaiswal observes that the laws of the ganas were termed as samaya. Now let's have a quick understanding about Indian villages during the Buddhist times. So and the people who have have followed this ideological approach have looked into the various Jain and Buddhist texts during the 5th and 6th century BC, and also the Jataka stories to understand the nature of Indian villages during the Buddhist and Jainist periods. And the scholars worth mentioning include Rice Davids, B.C. Srivastava, A.K. Warder, and J. Sarkar. So, coming to the Buddhist texts, the primary references include the Vinaya Pitika, Sukta Pitika, and Abhidhamma Pitika. And to understand, the life during Jain period, the primary texts are the Agamas and Pratham Anilok. So let's see, what are the terminologies used in these different texts to understand the structure of villages. So in the Buddhist texts, we could, read terms like, or we can see terms like Gama, Nigama, Kula, and Nagarka. And similarly, the Jain text talks about Ghosha, Kheta, Karvata, Grama, Palli, Patana, Samvaha, Ugara, and Matamba. So during this period, from these analysis of these texts, we could see that the average village consists of around 1,000 families, and the village dwellings were very close to each other, and the structure of the village was in such a way that there was this village gate or gram dwara, and then we have the village orchard, which is meant for the cultivation. Then we have the orchard and the village pasture. Let's understand about each of them in a bit detail. So what does it mean by Gram Kshetra? So it is a Gram Kshetra which is an individual property. It is an arable area. This is the area where people cultivate. So there was a well-planned demarcation about the individual property of each family, and each individual's property was demarcated with fences, snares, etc. And there was a field watchman to oversee all these. And a family could extend their arable area depending on the family size by clearing the forests. And to enable agriculture, there was a system of cooperative irrigation and water channels dividing land holdings, and it was a duty of the headman to oversee these irrigation facilities. So Rice Davis in his writings have talked a lot about all these systems. On the other hand, village pasture means it is a common property, be it for the king or for the commoner. So this is a common land which could be used by anybody for cattle grazing and also to collect the wood and fallen leaves for as fuel. There was a village official or employee called Gopalaka who was in charge of this, and we can see there was a very strong communal concept because everybody had equal grazing rights and they also have the right to pick fallen wood. Remember the word fallen wood because it's not about cutting trees. They can collect the fallen wood and dried leaves, but nobody is having an inheritance rights either by purchase, inheritance, or gift from the king. So even when the king is gifting land to a person, it cannot be from this village pasture. So we can see a strong, very strong communal concept existing there, and knowledge that there should be a common, land which should be the property of the particular village. And during this Buddhist time, we can also see the use of iron implements and crafts, coming in. So, the Buddhist principle of saying no to animal sacrifice and harming, animals might have, boosted agriculture, and uh, the coming in of iron axes, sickle, and other implements during the post 600 BC laid foundation for large scale settlements and also more labor intensive agriculture. So the possibility of clearing the jungles, cutting the big trees and making room for agriculture was made possible with all these iron implements. V.C. Srivastava writes that in particular areas like Mithila, Sankhyan and Kolian states, how there was a system of well-established irrigation facilities that supported agriculture, but it was not present everywhere. And some of the Pali texts also mentions that, or we'll get this idea that agriculture was almost considered identical with cow keeping. And a large scale agriculture, an established agricultural system evolved around 600 BC with the use of iron implements, and that have also resulted in the rise of urban settlements. And during this Buddhist period, we can see how the new agriculture, the trade, and the advent of coins helped both the rulers and traders to accumulate wealth, which in fact gave rise to economic inequalities also. So from this stage, we can see a substantial surplus of agricultural products. And now let's see how this got a leap during the Mauryan period. So it is from Kautilya's Arthashastra that we get a lot of information and ideas about the village life during that period. So the two points which are very relevant is during this period is, one is the big farms coming in under the direct control of state, and also the popularity and spread of labor intensive paddy cultivation. So we have the mentioning of the villages at a distance of 1 or 2 krosha. Krosha is a measurement of distance, and it also talks about a cluster of villages. Samagrahana is a cluster of 10. Karvatika is a cluster of 200. Dronamukha is for 400, and Mahagrama or Statnuja is for a cluster of 800 small villages. So the surplus production also results in more trade and commerce. So we can also see mentioning about the center of trade and fairs. Tatnuja was primarily a center for that. Now, let's coming to the village management and administration. So the text mentioned having village administrative staff having a clear-cut rules and responsibilities for promoting agriculture. And for the officials who carry out these tasks would be getting land free of rent, but however they cannot either sell or mortgage that. And based on population, during Chandragupta Maurya's time, there is a mentioning of 3 categories of villages. Kanishta being the smaller one, Madhyama becoming the middle ones, and Jyeshta the biggest one. It also talks about for other types of villages. There is an ordinary village called Gramagras, where people pay their regular revenue. And Pariharak villages are the revenue-free villages which the king would be gifting to the priests and teachers for the kind of service they do to the society, either by spreading education or by preaching dharma. Then we also had the soldiers, who contribute and support the kingdom during the war. They also get a revenue-free land, and such villages are called Ayudhuja village. And there are a 4th category of villages where the taxes being paid would be in kind, not in cash. So we can see from Mauryan period onwards, we can see how there is a well-established system of taxation existing, and how they were giving a very significant importance to assessment of land revenue. So there is a Samaharta, who is the highest officer in charge of revenue collection, and Sannidhata was a chief custodian of the state treasury. And we have seen that in certain villages the revenue would be collected in kind. So the kingdom was also having a provision of storage facilities to to keep all these collected revenues in kind. And coming to the taxation, generally the tax was levied at a rate of 1/4 of the produce. And another way in which state collected agricultural resource was through sharecropping. And sharecroppers would be given seeds, oxen, etc. And after cultivation, they should be giving half of the produce to the state. And the state was not just collecting revenues, it also had its own responsibility of providing the facility of irrigation. and there was a very clear-cut rules for the regulation of water supply. And the travelers who visited India during those times have recorded some of these things in their work. For instance, Megasthenes mentions how there was officials to measure the land, inspect water channels, and cess was levied only on irrigated soil. And this, the iron implements was something that resulted in agrarian expansion. And from this stage onwards, we can see big farms coming under the control of state. So by controlling the raw materials and manpower, how agriculture was used to have more surplus. So when it comes to paddy cultivation, we know that it is very labor intensive. It requires more than the peasant family's labor during certain particular seasons, especially during transplanting and harvesting. So Arthashastra also mentions how there were special attempts by the state of, in the way how they were settling new groups or transferring groups of people from an overpopulated areas to another region where they can cultivate, or deporting people from the defeated kingdoms to a barren or a deserted region to make that area agriculturally productive. For instance, the Shudra settlers were given some fiscal concessions, and they were also gifted with cattle and seeds along with implements to support agricultural practice. And especially people from the defeated kingdoms were transported to the decaying or ruined settlements, repopulating that area to augment agricultural production. So we can see a very well established agricultural based communal life during the period of Mauryans. And now with the Mughal period, there was already a common ownership of land, and villages continue to be the unit of revenue assessment. And only thing is that the land revenue was primarily now turned to be money payment. So coming to the revenue system, one share of the village income has to be given to the Raja, the king, and the other to the cultivators. At the same time, there was a proportionate share which should be given to people carrying out other responsibilities like the judge, the water surveyor, the Brahmin, the astrologer, the carpenter, the washerman, the dancing girls, musicians, and poets. So now we can see the Mughal influence was not that powerful. And we can see, the change, in the administration was not something that affecting fundamentally the land relations. Although the customary right of the village over land remained unaffected, the kind of support that the state used to give, to the villages discontinued. And insights about agrarian system of Mughal India could be seen through the writings of Irfan Habib. And most of the writings from Vedic times to the Mauryan period were primarily talking about the village life in the North India. And to specifically understand village communities in South India, Radhakumar Mukherjee, Altekar and Mathai have made an attempt by looking into the various inscriptions during the Chola king Parantaka, especially the Uttaramerur inscription of the 10th century. And Baudhayana, which is a treatise on law, mentions 5 characteristics to differentiate South Indian civilization. The points include dining with persons not initiated into the diner's caste or religious sect, dining with women, eating food kept overnight, marrying daughter of maternal uncle, and marrying daughter of paternal aunt. These were considered to be the major, unique, features that distinguishes the South Indian civilization from that of the North Indian one. So when we talk about the South Indian villages, the literature primarily, the sources, various sources primarily, looks into the cultural and linguistic provinces of Madras, Kerala, Mysore, and Andhra. And there are mentions about trade with China and Rome. And most of the villages were a cluster of mud, stone, and thatched buildings. Generally, a typical village used to have a population between 50 to 200. Cattle rearing was a major occupation, and every village is having a village temple. And coming to the village administration. So there is a mentioning about having several committees for village administration with specific responsibilities. And most importantly, was the role of village panchayats. So it is the village panchayat who have the elderly male members as the decision makers. They had the primary duties of the overall superintendence, collection of village revenue, and settling of disputes. And at a village level, they used to keep accounts of cultivation, and there was also a boundary man having the role of prescribing limits of village. So we can see that there is a lot of similarities between village life and village administration during this traditional times. And Indological accounts of Indian village is very essential because these scholars were looking into the various sacred and secular texts which were written during those times to explore, to understand how these works of mentioned village and village life, and have brought in insights from them to have to give us an idea about the kind of villages during those times. Thank you.